Base daf is daf Yud Gimel, and we get up to Omar Rafram Bar Papa, Omar Rav Chizda. That's just a few lines down from the top, 4 lines down from the top. So now we have a statement in the name of Rav Chizda about the Isur Rechitza. You're not allowed to wash yourself, bathe. And this Isur, the question is whether or not it applies exclusively to hot water or even to cold water. Kolshu mishum avel, in any Isur Rechitza, an avel is enjoined from 11 different Isurim during the Shiva Yomim after he buries his relative. And on that list of 11, one is in the Isur Rechitza, he's not allowed to wash himself and bathe. Kigon, Tisha B'Av, the avel. There's Avelus in 2 different ways. There's what we call Avelus Yeshana, the old Avelus for the Churban 2,000 years ago, and he's not allowed to wash himself on Tisha B'Av. And there's Avel of Avelus Chadasha, new Avelus, that Nebuchadnezzar just buried one of his relatives. There too, there's an Isur Rechitza for all 7 days of Avelus. There's Rav Chizda. Asur, this Rechitza is prohibited bein bechamin u bein betzone. It makes no difference whether or not he's bathing in hot water or cold water. And by the way, when it says v'chein v'avel, Rashi says it's a kolshke, because Avelus is even more chamur than Tisha B'Av. Avelus is in that state of quasi doraisa. It's not fully doraisa. Maybe the first day of Avelus is doraisa, but there is an element of a doraisa in the Isurei Avelus. Mashen Kein Tisha B'Av is purely the Rabbanan. In any event, Rav Chizda is committed to the position that the Isur Rechitza applies even b'tzonei. And v'kolshu mishum tanu. However, when there's a different kind of an Isur Rechitza, a lower grade Isur Rechitza, and when would that apply? Kigon Taanit tzibur. On a public fast day, when we get to the 3rd level of the most severe Isurim of a Taanit tzibur, bechamin asur b'tzonei mut. Meaning that in the case of Taanit tzibur, there's no separate Isur of Rechitza. What do I mean by a separate Isur Rechitza? Rechitza could come under one of 2 categories. It could be a Meiser Ritzicha, in and of itself, it's awesome. Or it could be a prohibition because it brings you to a state of timing. And herein lies the difference between Avel and Tisha B'Av as Avelus, as opposed to Taanit tzibur. In the case of Avelus, there's a separate Isur Meiser Rechitza. Whether Rechitza brings you to a state of tainug or does not is irrelevant. In contrast, says Rav Chizda, when it comes to a Taanit tzibur, there the Isur Rechitza is a whole different category of Isur. It's not a Meiser Rechitza that's also just bathing per se, but rather the result of bathing brings you into a state of oneg. And that state of oneg, when you're supposed to be mitztayer because there's no rains, etc., for Taanit tzibur, that Rechitza shel tainug, a pleasurable Rechitza, a luxurious bathing, that is antithetical to the state of tsar that is the essence of a Taanit tzibur. However, Rechitza per se is not an Isur. For example, in Avelus, we have a whole list of Isurim. Every one of those actions, there are 11 all told, are prohibited. We don't have to ask the question in each case of a violation of Avelus, is he bringing himself to a state of tainug or is he not? But in Taanit tzibur, the prohibition of Rechitza is because he's bringing himself to a state of tainug. It says Rechitza that's only in chamin, in hot water, but not in cold water. Cold water is not going to be a Rechitza shel tainug. We would like to bring a proof from the Mishnah to support Rav Chizda's claim that in a Taanit tzibur, the only prohibition of Rechitza is tainug, Rechitza shel tainug, but sodein is mutter. Because when the Mishnah defines the second set of tinios, that means there was a first set of tinios when it didn't rain, and then we got into a later date, and it still isn't raining. So we expanded and intensified the Isser tinios because of Atzirus Gitshamim, and we prohibited Rechitza. Noalim es hamerchatzos. We lock up the bathhouses. And the assumption is that the bathhouses are hot water. Then the Mishnah is telling us that the only problem here on a Taanit Tzibur is that the people might come to bathe in hot water. Therefore, we have to lock the doors of the bathhouses. However, if they want to wash themselves and bathe in cold water, that would be mutter. That supports the position of Rav Chisda. Abai says, wait a minute, Rav Yidi Barovin. What kind of proof do you have from the Mishnah, from the fact that it says no limits merchatzos? Let's argue from the opposite position against Rav Chisda. Let's assume that the Isser Rechitza on the Taanit applies even to Sonin. So what should it have said? That we lock up all the cold water sources? The Ibet Sonin Asur. So what should the Mishnah say? Sochrin, which means that we plug up Es HaNaharos, we should plug up all the rivers where there's cold water, so people shouldn't bathe in the rivers. That's ridiculous. He's asking a rhetorical question. So therefore, you don't have any proof from the fact that Tana says that you lock up the merchatzos. If we can lock up the rivers or any other source of cold water bathing, we would do the same. Don't prove from here to support Rav Chisda that Rechitza in Tzonein is mutter. Maybe Rechitza in Tzonein is likewise also, but they only locked up the merchatzos. So Rav Shisha, Bered Rav Iti, now comes to defend his father's proof from our Mishnah to support Rav Chisda and against the argument of Abaye. Abba, my father, Rav Yidi Barovin, proved and supported Rav Chisda because Hachi Kashle. He was bothered by the following question. Why did the Tana have to add the words Nol and Esemerchotzos? What does that mean? Does it mean that we have a chiyuv, that we have obligated to lock up all the merchatzos? That's not really what the Tana means. The Tana is only trying to convey that you're not allowed to bathe in a merchatzos in hot water. So therefore, Michti Tana, why did the Mishnah have to bother saying no lemes merchatzos? The Mishnah's already told us that rechitza is asura. So no lemes merchatzos, the additional words that we lock up the bathhouse is lamali. What was the need for the Mishnah to add those words? You've already established that rechitza is prohibited, and now you add a statement that we can't go into the bathhouses. If you're not allowed to bathe, then for sure you can't go into the bathhouse to bathe. So these three words, Nolan es merchatzos, are totally superfluous. Why did the Mishnah feel compelled to add words that don't teach me anything? And it must be that the Mishnah wanted to teach me that we should be medayek. Shmamina, it's telling me that b'merchatzos chamin asur. Since the water in the bathhouses is heated water, that's why you're not allowed to go into the bathhouse and bathe, implying that b'tzonein mutter. And that would be a proof from our Mishnah to support the position of Rav Chisda that with regard to a Taanit Tzibur, the only prohibition of Rechitza is anti-Tainug, but if it's not anti-Tainug, it's not antithetical to Tainug, namely, if he washes in cold water, that's okay, that's mutter. And now the Gemara wants to bring a support to Rav Chisda. Lema Misayeli, let's try to bring a support to Rav Chisda. Now, in order to appreciate this Gemara that we're about to learn, we should point out that Rav Chisda, if you read his statement carefully, has both a Reisha and a Seif. He has one din in the Reisha, and that's with regard to an Avel. And again, Avelus includes both Tisha B'Av, Avelus Yeshana, and Avelus Chadasha of the loss of one of his relatives. And the statement of Rav Chisda is that the Isser Rechitza is any Meiser Rechitza, including Tzoneh. So that's the Chumrah of Avelus. And in the Sefer, the second din of Rav Chisda is the Kula contrasting Taanit Tzibur, the Isur Achitza Taanit Tzibur, with that of Avelus. Since there's no element of Avelus in Taanit Tzibur, it's purely Tainug that's also, therefore we matir B'chitza B'toneh. Now, at this particular junction, the Gemara wants to go back to the Reisha of Rav Chisda and support Rav Chisda from a Brisa and prove that with regard to Avelus, the prohibition of Rechitza includes any Maisa Rechitza, not only a Rechitza Sheish B'Tainug, which is Chamin, but even a Maisa Rechitza B'Tzonin. What does it say in the Brisa? Now, we're talking about an obligation to be tovel in order to remove the state of tara, to remove the state of tumah and create a state of tara, and a zman tefillah. That's what we have to emphasize. Zman tefillah means there's a specific time and it's an urgency. For example, in the case of a nida, after the days of nidus have passed, now there's a chiyuv tefillah. So she comes on the chayvei tefillus. We have another case of yoledes, which will go into mikveh after 7 days for a zachar. She gave birth to a male, or 14 days after she gave birth to a female. These are called chayvei tefillus. Tovlin kedarka. We're going to permit them, these chayvei tefillus, for the sake of the mitzvah tefillah bismana, to bathe. Well, it's not a bathing. I guess you call it dunking yourself into a mikveh, but in effect, you are bathing. And we're going to allow that bein b'tisha b'av, bein b'yom HaKippurim. These are 2 days in the calendar year in which there's an Isur Achitza, but for the sake of the mitzvah, tefillah bisman of mitzvah, the urgency of tefillah now, we're going to permit tefillah b'mikvah, which in effect, if not for the fact that it was Tisha B'Av, if not for the fact that it was a tefillah bisman of mitzvah, it would be a violation of Tisha B'Av, a violation of Yom HaKippurim, because it's a tefillah. B'may. Let's ask ourselves the following question. What kind of tefillah are we talking about? You know, today, I don't have to tell you, you go to mikvos and they're very well heated. Like I can tell you about the mikvos we went to last week. I mean, they were wonderful, incredible. So b'may. Ilema, should we assume that we're talking about tefillah bechamin? If this was a heated mikvah, then I don't understand. Tefillah bechamin me'ika? What are you talking about? We're on Tisha B'Av or Yom HaKippurim. Now, on Yom HaKippurim, you're not allowed to turn on a fire. There's an Isur of Havaras Eish. How could they have possibly heated up the mikvah on Yom HaKippurim? On Tisha B'Av, that's okay. There's no Isur of turning on a fire on Tisha B'Av, because there's no Isur Melechas Havar on Tisha B'Av. But on Yom HaKippurim, how are you going to justify your position that you're suggesting that the tefillah was b'mayim chamin? Furthermore, the Gemara says, even if you'll tell me that they drew water from the mikvah into a large vessel, and they, right before Yom Kippur, they turned on the fire underneath that vessel, which is called kli, then she'uven minu, that's called drawn water. Drawn water that's taken out of a mikvah is pasul l'tevila. So this whole entity, the Gemara thinks, of hot bathing in a mikvah on Yom HaKippurim is impossible. You'd have to conjure up a case of mayim in a kli, where they heated up the eish underneath the kli, maybe before Yom Kippur, but nevertheless, it's mayim she'uvim, be pasul to a mikvah. The whole purpose of allowing this tefillah is because of the chiyuv and the mitzvah of tefillah. Ela, therefore, by process of elimination, we have to assume that this price is talking about bitzonen and it's cold water. And why would they allow you to go into this mikvah that's cold? It must be because chayvei tefillos, because you're obligated in tefillah. As we said before, these are tmeim that have a certain zman tefillah, and it's urgent. In That's when they were matir tefillah kidarkam, the regular kind of tefillah, into this cold mikvah on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippurim. But in Ishakrina, if you have a person who just wants to bathe for the sake of bathing and he is not obligated in the midst of tefillah for Tara purposes, they would not allow him to do this rechitza, even though it's mayim sonanin. So we see clearly from this brisa support for Rav Chisda's position that on Tisha B'Av it's also lirchal, it's even bitzonen. And now we have the antagonist, and that is Omar Rav Chana Bar Ktina. So it really pays to underline the name here because it's going to come up again. So the person who's trying to reject Rav Chisda, his name is Rav Chana Bar Ktina. And he's going to assume that we're talking about tefillah in a hot mikvah. And as far as a cold mikvah is concerned, we don't need a matir of chayvei tefillah, because we would say that the tzonein is mutter. In other words, Rav Chana Bar Ktina's position is that even with regard to avelus, the Isser Rechitza is because it's antithetical to the state of avelus, because it's a Rechitza Shel Tainu. But if it's not a Rechitza Shel Tainu, and he's only bathing in cold water, then it's mutter against Rav Chisda. No, but you'll ask me, here they were matir tefillah of mitzvah, and it looks like we're talking about a cold mikvah. Meaning, had it been a regular bathing situation, which would be devoid of any element of mitzvah, it would have been prohibited, even though it's mayim tzonanim. No. Says Rav Chana Bar Ktina, this brisa is talking about a case of mayim chamim. How in the world are you going to achieve that goal, that is tefillah in mayim chamim? And the answer is lo nitzcha ella lechame Tveria. And the springs of Tveria are always hot. They are not mayim she'uvim. They were not taken into a vessel. They are kosher for tefillah, even though it's hot water. And therefore, we need a special matir of tefillah bismana to override avelus in the case of mayim chamim. But mayim sonanim would be mutter for anybody, even shalo b'tefillah bismana mitzvah, in avelus against Rav Chisda. So again, let's keep in mind that the antagonist here is Rav Chana, and his opinion is that with regard to tzonen, under all situations, all circumstances, not just in Taanit Sibur, but even in Avelus and Tisha B'Av, you're allowed to bathe in cold water because it's not called a Rechitza Shel Tainu. And now the Gemara is going to barrage Rav Chana Bar Ktina and try to defend Rav Chisda. If you're telling me that this brisa is addressing a case of a person who's being tovel in mayim chamim, but as far as sonain is concerned, anyone's allowed to be rochetz, even if he doesn't have this mitzvah to be rochetz. Any ovel is allowed to rechitza b'tzonein. Amos seifa. Let's look at the brisa that quotes a dissenting opinion as far as permitting tefillah on Tisha B'Av for the sake of tefillah bisman mitzvah. Rab Chanina Skan HaKohanim, even Tmeim, who have Zman Tfilosan on Tisha B'Av, and there's an urgency for them to be Tovel and fulfill the mitzvah of Tfilah. Bismana, nevertheless, we're not going to allow them to be Tovel against the Tanna Kama. Tanna Kama said that when we prohibited Rechitza in Avelus, that's only Rechitza Shalol L'Shem Mitzvah. But if it's a Rechitza Shal Mitzvah, like the case of Tfilas, Tefillah Bismana, there was never an Isser as far as Avelus is concerned. Comes along Rab Chanina B'Skan Kohanim, he says, wait a minute, you have a collision here between the Avelus, the mitzvah Avelus, and the mitzvah of Tefillah. You know what? Avelus is more important and it trumps Tefillah. Kedai hu beis Elokeinu, li abed olav Tefillah pamachas b'shana. The mitzvah of Avelus for the Churban Abayis, says Rabbi Chanina, is more severe than the mitzvah of Tefillah Bismana. You know what? We'll trump the mitzvah of Tefillah Bismana for the sake of a kiyum avelus yeshana of avelus al churban abayis. Wait a minute. Why do we have to give up the mitzvah of tefillah for the sake of avelus? Efshel kaim shneim, the Gemara says, if according to your shita of Chana bar Ketina, they only prohibited it in avelus, that kind of rechitza that is a rechitza shel tainit. But if it's a rechitza shel lo l'shem tainit, named bitzonein, it's mutter. Is then yirchatz bitzonein? Why does Rabbi Chanina say le'aved olav, meaning that he's forfeiting the mitzvah of rechitza of tvila? He's not forfeiting the mitzvah of tvila. Let him be tovel a rechitza bitzonein. Amarav Papa be asrid lo shtiach tzonein. That this brisa says Rav Papa, and now Rav Papa is defending the position of Rav Chana bar Ketina, is dealing with a situation where there is no availability of tzonein. And really, we can support Rav Chana bar Ketina's position that rechitza shel tzonein is mutter for anyone, even if he's not a tvila shalobe bismana mitzvah, against Rav Chizda. And that which Rav Chanina Skan HaKodim says la'abid olav tefillah, he's talking about a case where there is no availability of a cold mikvah. There's only a hot mikvah. And since we're going to prohibit tefillah b'chamin, therefore, says Rav Chanina bar Skan Kodim, he's going to lose and forfeit the mitzvah of tefillah. There's only an option of tefillah b'chamin. And let him forfeit that for the sake of Beis Elokeinu. So therefore, again, this brisa has no proof whatsoever to Rav Chisda that the Isa Rechitza on Tisha B'Av applies even to Tzoneh. Okay, now we go to the Seifa, the second din of Rav Chisda, about Taanit Sibur. Rav Chisda was of the position that on a Taanit Sibur you're allowed to be Rochetz B'Tzonein and Kaches to Avelus. Tashma, let's bring a proof from a brisa that even on a Taanit Sibur there's an Isur Rechitza B'Tzonein against Rav Chisda. Now we had a Mishnah back on Daf Yud Beis that those middle tinios and the last tinios that are fasted for Atziras B'Shav because there's no rain, there are a whole list of Isurim, of prohibitions, in addition to Achila and Shasiyah. You're not allowed to do Malacha, you're not allowed to wear shoes, you're not allowed to do Rechitza. And the Brisa comments on that Mishnah, Kisha Amru, when they said about Yom Tainus, meaning a Taanit Sibur, Asur B'Malacha, in those second and third sets of tinios, you're enjoined from doing Malacha. Lo Amru Ela B'Yom, that's only by daytime. Aval B'Layla Mutter. At night, you're allowed to do Malacha. Why? Because the Isur Malacha on a Taanit Sibur is derived from a pasuk in Nach, Yoel Kiru. It says Kiru Atzara. And in that pasuk, he mentions Asifas Kenim, and Asifas Kenim on a Yom Tainus is during the day. I mistakenly said yesterday it's in the second half of the day, it's in the first half of the day. Anyway, Sha'amru Asur B'Nila Sasandala Amru Ela B'Ir. Inside the urban area, you're prohibited from wearing shoes. Aval B'Derech, if you are going outside the city limits, mutter, you're allowed to wear sandal, a leather shoe. HaKetzad, Yotze L'Derech, Noah, when he goes out to the road, he should wear his shoes. Nichnas La'ir, but as soon as he comes into the city, Choletz, he takes off his shoes. And by the way, this heter, to wear shoes when he's Choletz B'Derech outside the city, is only for someone who's going barefoot. But if, says the Magen Avram, he's riding a horse, or he's sitting in a wagon, or he's riding in a car, then he would have to take off his shoes. Uksha Amru Asur B'Rechitza, when they said about a Yom Taanit Sibur that you're not allowed to bathe, Lo Amru Ella Rechitzas Kol Gufa. Aval Rechitzas Panav Yadav Raglav Mutter. He's allowed to wash segments of his body, but not his whole body. He cannot immerse his entire body into a bath. And this is the part of the price that we have to focus our attention on. And for that, we'll have to learn a Mitzvah Shem coming around the bend, Masechet Moed Katan, about a menuda, somebody who's put into nidui. Ubi Avel, somebody who never lost one of his close relatives. The same halach applies to Menuda and to Avel. And these categories of individuals are enjoined from Rechitza, but only Rechitza is called Gufa. So the Gemara asks, this last part of the Brisa that says, V'chein ata motzei, b'menuda uba avel, what is it talking about? Lava kulu. Isn't it referring to all the dinim that are enumerated into the Brisa that apply to not only a Taanit Sibur situation, but also to a Menuda and an Avel? What kind of a chitza is this Brisa addressing, in which it differentiates between kol gufo as opposed to parts of his body like panav yad v'raglo? If you're going to suggest bechamin, that the subject here of this price of rechitza as an is bechamin in hot water, then I have the following question to ask you. The Brisa finishes up by saying that in which case you're telling me that he's allowed to wash parts of his body in avelus, even if it's hot water, and panav yada v'raglav in hot water, misharu. Can you tell me that an avel is permitted to wash his feet, his hands, his face in hot water? For Amar Rav Sheshes, the Gemara says that Rav Sheshes, so the Gemara later on, is talking in the name of Rav Chizda. Asr avel asr lahoshet etzbo b'chavet. Even to place his finger into warm water, to hot water, he's not allowed to do so. Elah, by process of elimination, we must be talking about an Isur Rechitza, Bitzone. And now we're differentiating between Rechitzas called Gufo, which is prohibited, and it's prohibited on a Taanit Sibur. And only Rechitzas Panav Yadav V'Raglav is mutter. And the same thing applies to Menuda and Abel, but it's clear, therefore, that we can prove for this price that a Taanit Sibur is Asr B'Rechitza B'Tzonen if it's called Gufo. Whereas Rav Chizda was the one who was Matir Rechitza B'Tzonen on a Taanit Sibur. And here we have the famous Kasha, Sasemis and others. How does the Gemara know that Rav Chizda was Matir, even Rechitza is called Gufo B'Tzonen? Maybe when Rav Chizda was Matir Rechitza B'Tzonen, he was only Matir Rechitza's Panav Yadav V'Raglav. And that's a long discussion. In any event, the Gemara answers, low. We're not talking about Rechitza B'Tzonen. Leolam Bechamin, we're talking about Rechitza Bechamin in this Brisa. And with regard to Rechitza Bechamin, the Brisa is differentiating between Kol Gufo as opposed to Panav Yadav V'Raglav. Now, in Kol Gufo, we have what's called Gufo Rachutz. He changes his status. He's now a Rachutz. In Panav Yadav V'Raglav, it's only a partial Meiser Rechitza, and that is mutter according to the Brisa. Uda Kashala. And if you're telling me, wait a minute, if it's hot water, how could the Brisa say B'chein Tomotzi V'Menuda Ba'avel when Rav Sheshes tells us that in regard to Avelus, even Lahoshet Etzbo B'Mayim, in a case of Mayim Chamim, even to place his finger into the hot water is prohibited? And the answer is that last part of the Brisa, B'chein Tomotzi V'Menuda Ba'avel, that's not talking about all the dinim that are listed earlier in the Brisa, the entire enumeration, including Rechitza, but rather Asha'ara Koi. It's only referring to other dinim, not to the din of Rechitza. As far as the Isur Rechitza is concerned, then there's a difference between a Menuda and an Ovel on the one hand, and Taanit Sibur on the other hand. On Taanit Sibur, you're allowed to be Rochetz Becham in Panav Yadav V'Raglav. That's on Taanit Sibur. On Ovel is Asur, even Lahoshet Etzbo B'Mayim. And since this Brisa is addressing a case of Rechitza B'Chamin, therefore it is not a question on Rav Chizda, who is Matir Rechitza on the Taanit Sibur B'Tzonen. Now the Gemara goes back to the Din Arishon, the ratio of Rav Chizda, who says that an Ovel is enjoined from Rechitza even B'Tzonen. And the Gemara has a kasha from a Brisa. Toshma, listen to the Brisa. And we're going to prove that an oval is allowed to be rochetz bitzonen, whereas Rav Chisda says an oval is also lirchotz bitzonen. The Amar Rav Abba Kohen, Mishum Rav Yossi HaKohen, Meisu, Banav, Shal Nebuch. Banav means he lost two sons. Shal Rav Yossi ben Rabbi Chanina, Virachatz bitzonen kol shiva, during the entire course of his Avelos of 7 days. He was rochetz bitzonen. How do we square that with Rav Chisda, who says that during Avelus, even Rechitza B'tzonen is also, as we said at the outset, the Rav Chisda holds that in Avelus they prohibited a Ma'aser Rechitza. And he's bathing, Kol Gufo, B'mayim Tzonen, that's prohibited. And he says, name, there was a special Heter Rechitza in the case of Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Chanina, and why is that Hassam? Shetakfu Avelov Have. He went from one Avelus into the next Avelus. Nebuch, what it means is he lost two sons, one right after the other. So he was in the state of Avelus when he lost his second son, and he went into a second state of Avelus. And that is, it's too much to ask him and enjoin him from Rechitza, B'tzonen at least, for that entire period of Avelus that now spans such a long period of time. To go without washing your body over that long period of time, they didn't expect that we could prohibit it. And therefore, although an Avel is asur b'rechitza b'tzonen, like Rav Chisda, but nevertheless here in the case of Rav Yossi, because Takfu Avel of Olav, they were Mekil and they allowed him to be Rochetz b'tzonen. This Sanya, we have a Bryce in Takfu Avel of Zachar Zeh. We're going to be Mekil with regard to haircuts and bathing and washing one's clothes. When you go from one Avelus, Takef, into another Avelus. And therefore, Hichbit Sa'aro, if he's got a lot of hair and it's bothering him, Mekil Bitar, he's allowed to take a razor and cut his hair. Why? Because Takfu Avelus. And in addition, we have a leniency with regard to washing his clothes. Mechabes Ksuso B'mayim. He's allowed to wash his clothes in water. We'll soon see without detergent. Amar Rav Chisda, that which we learned in this price that we would make it with regard to cutting his hair if it gets very heavy on him, is only bitar. That's not the normal way you would cut your hair with a razor. But the normal way that you would cut your hair, a haircut would be with scissors. But he's got to do it b'shinu. He has to do it in an unusual way. Even in this case of Takfu Avelov, they were only makil to do a tispores, but a tispores in an unusual way, and also washing his clothing in an unusual way, but mayim, v'lo b'neser, and not with natron, v'lo b'chol, and not with sand, which are detergents that they used to use to clean blood. And he's required to do a shinui midarka. And they were makel in takfu avela with regard to tispores and kibbutz b'gadim. They were also makel with regard to rechitza, and they were matir to allow him to be rochetz b'tzonen. But a regular avel who's not takfu avelava zachar zeh is prohibited from rechitza b'tzonen. On our Rava, we're going to have two lishonos in Rava. Now we're doing the first lishna in Rava. Avel mutar lirchotz b'tzonen kol shiva. We are going to allow an avel to wash his body in cold water for the entire balance of his 7 days of Avelus, even though there's some element of tainug in this rechitza. But you know what? Not every tainug is by definition prohibited during Avelus. I'll prove it to you. He's allowed to drink wine. He's allowed to eat meat, not during Aninus, but after burial. And once he's in Avelus, they were permitting him to eat meat and drink wine, even though these are actions that have a tainug. And rechitza is called gufa b'tzonei. Even if you argue that he gets some sort of tainug out of it, it's permitted during Avelus. Now, here we have to ask ourselves the question, according to Rava, this is the Lishna Kama of Rava, why would they allow rechitza b'tzonei even if you agree that it's tainug? L'chora, if it's a rechitza shel tainug, it certainly should be prohibited. So we're going to have to say that there are different levels of rechitza shel tainug. And the paradigm of Rechitza Shel Tainug in the extreme sense is Rechitza B'chamin. But in Rechitza B'tzoni, which is a lower level, lower case of Tainug, they were matir.